Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you joining us from all over the world today. We have a really interesting program today to look at fertilizer, soil health, and economic shocks. What are some of the policy lessons that we have learned from the recent events that have affected the fertilizer trade and use in many countries around the world? We're really excited to hear from you. We'll have two separate question and answer sessions today, and you can join us by using your various platforms to submit your questions or the hashtag AskIFPRI at Twitter. It's now my pleasure to turn over to Ruth Hill, who is the Director of IFPRI's Markets, Trades, and Institution Division, who will give us some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, and good morning and afternoon, everybody. It's really my pleasure to provide introductory remarks to this policy seminar on fertilizer, soil health, and economic shocks, which is jointly organized by IFPRI and Food Policy. And the seminar is being organized on the occasion of the publication of a really fantastic special issue of Food Policy on fertilizer and soil health policies in the context of global supply disruptions and economic crises. As Charlotte mentioned, over the next hour and a half, authors and editors of the special issue will present evidence on the medium-term effects of rising fertilizer prices, with a special focus on smallholder farmers in low and middle-income countries, and some common and emerging policy responses in this space. And then we'll have a panel of fertilizer experts discussing how these insights can support policymakers seeking to mitigate price volatility to strengthen soil health and ensure resilience in agricultural production, particularly during adverse weather events and economic shocks. We have a really impressive lineup of speakers, and I'll quickly hand over to them. Before I do so, I would just wanted to make 2 points. First, on why I think this special issue makes such an important contribution to the evidence in this space. The special issue takes head on the fact that the question of how to support agricultural production through fertilizer use is complex. It underscores that the question of fertilizer use cannot be considered separately from the question of how it supports soil health, of how to support soil health. That these need to be considered together to support increased food production in a way that respects planetary boundaries. The issue also underscores the important role of shocks and market conditions, both fertilizer prices and market prices, in determining the returns and behavior of farmers. And in particular, it focuses on the market returns and risk in a way that's really, really unique and not often the case in this literature, and highlights the need to consider a broad range of policies when supporting agricultural productivity growth through soil and health and fertilizer investments. In articulating this complexity clearly and providing compelling evidence around this, I think the special issue provides exactly the right backdrop for a nuanced and insightful policy discussion. Which really brings me to the second point that I wanted to make, which is why all of this matters for policy. Despite the complexity of the challenge, for the most part, fertilizer subsidies are the policy instrument of choice across countries, across different income categories. And when fertilizer prices skyrocketed in 2022, fertilizer subsidies were the go-to policy instrument, even though many of those supporting their implementation knew these for what they were, which is a blunt instrument to address a complex challenge. There's a need to look for other simple policy solutions and packages of simple policy solutions that address the complexity more adequately and create the right incentives for fertilizer and soil health investments. We need to make sure that when the next crisis occurs, there are a range of proven policy tools that can be used, and the evidence in this issue puts us on that track. I'm on the program as coming in again with closing remarks and look forward to discussing then how we're taking some of these ideas forward in future work, particularly under the new CGIAR Policy Innovation Science Program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruth. It's now my pleasure to, I'm having some computer issues, Mabel. It's now my pleasure to introduce Chris Barrett, who is well known to many of the people that we have on this call. He is a professor of applied economics at Cornell. And very importantly for this purpose, he's also the co-editor of the Food Policy Journal, which is where this special issue is being published. Chris, it's also important to note that food policy is celebrating 50 years this year, as is IFPRI. So this is perhaps also a dual anniversary seminar for our two organizations. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Charlotte. As Charlotte just indicated, I'm the co-editor-in-chief along with Holly Wang from Michigan State University of the journal Food Policy. We're celebrating our 50th year this year, as is IFPRI. I'm also chair of IFPRI's Strategies and Priorities Committee. So I have real delight in seeing this seminar advance because I think it really highlights IFPRI's role in helping to stimulate really cutting-edge research on some of the most important topics related to food policy, as well as highlighting food policy's role in helping to both peer review and to disseminate such findings. First and foremost, I want to congratulate the guest editors led by Kibrom Abay at IFPRI. The guest editors did a really fabulous job of recruiting a significant set of submissions and in exercising a very vigorous peer review system to ensure good quality control and ultimately generating a really fine special issue of 15 papers. I congratulate the authors on their significant contributions and in navigating that process in a timely fashion. And I really want to highlight one that this special issue and these papers are important for 4 reasons, and they're very timely. The four big reasons why these papers collectively are so important is first, and perhaps most obviously, soils are absolutely essential to agricultural productivity. That is not news to anybody on this call. Perhaps not everyone is aware that around the world, most countries have seen negative fluxes in key soil nutrients, especially the main productivity boosting nutrients, N, P, and K, but also in key micronutrients. And this negative flux arises mainly because smallholder farmers in most of the global south routinely underapply fertilizers and other soil nutrient amendments. So a first order challenge for maintaining and boosting agricultural productivity is to reverse the negative soil nutrient fluxes we observe in most of the world. And the policies that this special issue addresses speak directly to that issue of first order importance. The second reason why this matters is soil health matters not just to the volume of output produced, but also to nutrients, to human nutrition, because the soils are the primary source of the minerals that are so essential to healthful life. Most of where we get zinc and iron from originates in the soils drawn up through crops and made available through our diets. So as soil quality degrades, not only does the volume of output decline, but so does the quality. And the human nutritional challenges that we're all quite aware of, therefore, are also closely caught up in soil health and thus in fertilizer and soil policies. Third, for those of us who are thinking about economic policy more broadly, some of the really high-level key issues in agricultural development economics all ultimately turn on questions of what are soil conditions like, whether it is thinking about the inverse farm-size productivity relationship that for years motivated land reforms, but many people began to suspect might be at least partly attributable to unobserved heterogeneity in soil quality that manufactures that sort of correlation, or whether it is claims about smallholder technical or allocative inefficiency that motivate everything from extension work to prospective redistributions or land tenure reforms, all of which turns on whether we're accurately estimating technical and allocative efficiency given unobserved heterogeneity in soil. So many of the first order issues that don't directly concern soils ultimately turn on whether we measure and understand soils well. And the fourth big issue is that key environmental and health outcomes are likewise closely caught up with soils. The overuse of fertilizers in much of the high-income world and in China is very strongly associated with, indeed, a cause of water pollution, hazardous algal blooms, et cetera. But it's also implicated in the rise of waterborne infectious disease like schistosomiasis in much of the global south. So the topics that this special issue tackles are really important. And it's a very timely special issue. As Ruth already highlighted, we've seen dramatic food and fertilizer price shocks. These are distressingly common in the global economy today. And it's often underappreciated how those impact whether and how farmers manage the fertility of soils on which life depends. Second, COVID really stressed government budgets all around the world. And whatever one thinks of fertilizer subsidy programs, they have been the policy instrument of choice in much of the global south, and they're increasingly unaffordable. So what do governments that are increasingly strapped for cash do to meet the needs of farmers to maintain soil fertility if they can't afford fertilizer subsidy programs the way they were for a number of years? Third, there are major advances in soils measurement, in sensing technologies, in data science, and these open up really exciting research opportunities for scholars to more carefully and accurately track changing soil conditions, to more rigorously research the sorts of questions I mentioned before about fundamental economic strategies for agricultural development. And finally, we need more cost-effective and inclusive policy instruments to promote and sustain soil health around the world, especially in the most marginal areas and among the most vulnerable rural populations. This set of 15 papers really does a fantastic job of summarizing many of these issues, in unearthing important new findings, and in helping to stimulate a dialogue around appropriate policies to improve soils around the world, especially in the global south. I congratulate and thank the editors and authors, and I strongly encourage everyone to go read the papers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris and Ruth, for those opening remarks. And I think you've really nicely laid out a whole range of policy topics that we will be discussing today and getting your questions and comments about. I appreciate in particular, Chris, you're mentioning the fact that in many parts of the world, we're actually mining the soils for nutrients. Fertilizers tend to get a lot of, and in some cases, certainly well-deserved bad press for environmental impacts due to overuse. But we can never forget that in many parts of the world, not enough fertilizers are being used, which also then leads to negative environmental impacts in terms of soil nutrient mining. So I think that's really important to just keep front and center in any discussion on fertilizers. So now we're going to dive right into some of the key findings and learnings from this special issue. And to do this for us, we're going to have that overview from Kibrom Abay, who is a senior research fellow here at IFPRI. And then we will turn to some of the chapter authors. And I think we can only present a few of the chapters, but they're going to do a great job of bringing together also key topics addressed in this series. Over to you, Kibrom.
Thank you, Charlotte. Okay, let me make this full screen. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Charlotte. And thank you all for joining us for this session. So I'm tasked to provide an overview of the special issue and a synthesis of or a summary of the findings. And we did that in one of the papers we have included in the special issue, but I can't imagine doing justice to all the 15 papers included in the next 10 minutes. So I'm not going to aim to be comprehensive. Because of that, I encourage you and invite you all to go through the special issue and the papers that are included. We have 15 papers that cover and tackle different challenges in this space. With that, I would like to start by thanking my colleagues and co-guest editors, including Jordan Chamberlain from CIMMYT, Pauline Chiveng from the International Rights Research Institute, and then David Spielman from IFPRI. I would also like to thank the co-guest editor, Chris Barrett, who helped, the editor, co-editor-in-chief, Chris Barrett, who helped us and guided us a lot in this process. And I'm also thankful for the authors who submitted several great papers to this special issue. With that, I'm happy to proceed to motivate the special issue. And the whole motivation of the special issue revolved around the global food, fuel, fertilizer price shock and disruption we experienced in the last few years. This started with the COVID pandemic in 2020, and then the Russia-Ukraine war sent price and markets to their peaks, as you can see in this figures, where we see that price of fertilizers and price of food items reached at their peak immediately after the Russia-Ukraine war. And this also triggered a number of public policy and trade responses, including bans from countries and also import and export restrictions. This was the whole motivation of the special issue, and we aimed to generate evidence to support the debate and discourse on this crisis. So with that in mind, we then we came up with some broad objectives and questions for the special issue.
I can't.
And some of these questions include the following four.
This start working.
We were interested in to
On and off my
examine and produce evidence on how global supply shocks affected fertilizer use, production and productivity and soil health in different production systems. And what are the policy interventions that are needed or have been adopted to navigate these periods of market volatility? And we were also interested in the type of innovations that might help to mitigate the impact of short-term shocks to fertilizer price or long-term trends, including the declining soil health. And we were also interested in bringing evidence on how policymakers can reconcile the productivity growth objectives with sustainability challenges. With these objectives, we launched this special issue and we attracted quite a large number of submissions, and we ended up going through the review, the peer review process, and we finally identified 15 papers that cover a number of challenges. And I'm happy that these papers address a broad range of geographies and thematic challenges and problems. We have some papers addressing low uptake of and adoption of inorganic fertilizer in low input farming systems, particularly from Africa. And we have some papers tackling overuse and sustainability challenges in high input farming systems, including some papers focusing on Bangladesh and China. And we also have some papers that aim to decompose and attribute changes in fertilizer price into energy and food prices, as well as trade restrictions. And then we have some papers trying to estimate pass-through and transmission between global and domestic prices. And of course, we have some papers studying policy responses that were invoked and introduced in response to the crisis. Of course, some of the papers tackle fertilizer use in fragile and conflict-affected food systems. Okay, so what do we learn out of these papers in terms of systematic patterns and evidence? Particularly, the first one relates to the transmission in prices and shocks from global to domestic markets. And despite the fact that production of fertilizer is heavily concentrated in a handful of few countries, as you can see in this picture, where in this graph, where most of the nitrogen and phosphate and potash fertilizers are produced in a handful of countries. But despite this concentration, we see that fertilizer price increase transmitted very quickly globally. But when it comes to the next step, when domestic prices were starting to decline, we don't see a similar pattern. And particularly in Africa, domestic price didn't follow the suit when international prices were starting falling. This is what we call asymmetric transmission and responses. And there are a number of factors that some of the papers address for this. And then we have some papers providing evidence on impacts on demand, farm management, and profitability. And again, here we see slight differences in responses across different farming systems. In particular, in the developed world, we don't see a huge reduction in demand and the use of fertilizer. But when it comes to Africa and other developing regions, we see that the input-output price ratio has increased significantly, and that has triggered a reduction in adoption of fertilizer. And this reduction shows a lot of heterogeneity, particularly across smallholder farmers, where we see that smallholder farmers are more responsive to changes in prices. And we also see that poor households appear to be more affected, particularly in terms of the discontinued fertilizer use that we see in some of the papers. When it comes to public responses that had been used by governments, obviously subsidies appear to be popular and convenient tools, and we have some evidence showing that fertilizer subsidies may have shielded some level of price volatility. while also slowing recovery and market integration. And we also have some evidence showing particularly on crowding out of private sector. Some of the papers provide evidence on the role and impact of price stabilization policies, including on the import and export restrictions imported by China and Russia. And toward the end of the paper, we also, in the synthesis paper, we also discuss solutions and innovations and investments to improve soil health. And then, as you would imagine, we haven't addressed all the knowledge gaps that we thought and identified at the beginning, and there is definitely the need for more evidence, particularly on farm level responses and impacts. And we also lack evidence on implications on national macroeconomic conditions, as well as the role of markets and institutions. And of course, we also lack some evidence on environmental consequences of the shocks, and including on instruments and frameworks that can help to implement an optimal fertilizer use levels at different levels. With that, let me stop here. Thank you very much. Back to you, Charlotte. You're muted, Charlotte.
My apologies. I'm having major computer issues. Thank you so much, Kibrom, for highlighting those findings and the need for lots more work to be done on these topics. I'm now turning the floor to David Spielman, who's the director of the Innovation and Policy Scaling Unit, who will in turn lead a panel of authors of the special series. Over to you, David.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Charlotte. Everybody can hear me, I hope. So I'm the moderator of this first session where we're going to talk or have a conversation with the authors about the country and cross-country policy experience. The four authors that I'm bringing to the table in this panel are as follows: Akuffo Amankwah, who's a senior economist at the World Bank; Catherine Ragasa, a senior research fellow here at IFPRI; Jaweriah Hazrana, a postdoctoral research fellow at Arizona State University; and Pauline Chivenge, senior scientist at the International Rice Research Institute. And also Pauline is a co-guest editor, like myself, of this special issue. So everybody, I hope, has their cameras on, and we can get started. So I want to pitch the first question to the three of you who are the authors of the studies, country and cross-country studies. That's Akuffo, Jaweriah, and Catherine. I'd ask the three of you, let's start with Akuffo and then Jaweriah and then Catherine. Please give us a brief overview of your study. Tell us, why were you motivated to conduct this study? What were the issues that you wanted to address? And most importantly, what were your key findings? Akuffo, over to you.
Thank you very much, David, and to the IFPRI team for inviting me to join this discussion. So our paper, we sought to provide micro insights into how the polycrisis, which we define as the conflation of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then the Russia-Ukraine war, and another domestic insecurities and conflicts percolated to smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan African countries, looking at 6 countries: Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, Malawi, Nigeria, Tanzania, and Uganda. And we try to understand this polycrisis in the context of fertilizer use and, how the high prices, the coping strategies that these farmers adopted in the response to the high prices. And basically, what we found is that agriculture as a livelihood strategy remained fairly stable during the polycrisis period, starting from 2020 all the way to 2024, which was the end date for our study. And this agriculture being the main employment buffer for households in the region. The other thing that we also found was that at the aggregate, fertilizer use in the study countries appear to have remained stable, though there were a lot of cross-country heterogeneity. For instance, in half of the countries that we studied, we observed a decrease in the share of households using fertilizer during the polycrisis period. But then also we saw in the other half, an increase in that as well. The other thing that we observed we found in our paper is that there was a large share of households that disadopted or discontinued fertilizer use during the polycrisis period. These households were actually using fertilizer during before the COVID-19 pandemic, but during the period of the study, they disadopted fertilizer use. And this disadoption, we found that to be more prevalent or concentrated among poorer farmers. The other thing that we found in our study is that at the intensive margin, a large share of households, use less than half of the fertilizer they actually needed. They applied less than half of the fertilizer they actually needed. And the main reason for this shortfall in fertilizer use was affordability. That was the main reason that they're reported by the farmers for this shortfall. And of course, in that spirit of coping with this high fertilizer shortfall and then the high prices, the farmers in our study countries adopted a number of strategies. Some of the strategies that they adopted appear to be productivity enhancing, or seem to complement or substitute for inorganic fertilizer, like the use of organic fertilizer, legume intercropping, among others. But then there are others that actually adopted strategies that appear to be unfavorable to ag productivity in the sense that they applied fertilizer, inorganic fertilizer at lower rates, and then some of them also applied to a fraction of their cultivated land, which of course, has implication for productivity. And for the high prices, one of the strategies that stand out, the coping strategies that these households adopted, were to borrowing money to actually be able to purchase the inputs. And then some of them also ended up selling productive assets in order to be able to buy the inputs. And the conclusion that we drew based on these coping strategies is that the high fertilizer prices might actually be forcing these farmers to drain down on their limited assets, and that has implication for potential shocks that might come they might experience in the future. So that is a summary of our paper. Back to you, David.
Excellent, Akuffo. Thank you very much. Now I know, Akuffo, your analysis was based primarily on the living standards measurement surveys, the National Statistical Agency household surveys in the countries you looked at. And our next author, Catherine Ragasa, I believe, had a multi-country study that used the same type of data, the same sources, different time periods, different countries to some extent. Catherine, tell us about your study.
Thank you, David. We conducted our study in response to specific requests from the government ministries in the countries we work on, Ghana, Nigeria, and Malawi, to look into yield responsiveness and profitability of inorganic fertilizer use amidst this rising input prices to guide in their policy making. The second motivation that we had in our studies are interest to complement the experimental and field trial data so that we can capture, data to capture more diversity of farming systems and actual farmer conditions. We know that experimental data and field trial data are available, and they usually show high yield response to inorganic fertilizer, hence the heavy promotion in many of the countries. However, we've also seen that in more recent field trial data, we are seeing more occurrences of non-responsiveness of maize plots. And I'll name one example. Ichami et al. 2019 show that 18% of the maize plots are non-responsive plots, according to their meta-analysis. Hence, we have done our study that looks at 6 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We've analyzed large-scale panel national representative data in 6 countries where we have, plot level data so that we can analyze the yield response. We've looked at 2008 to 2022 panel data sets, whatever is available in the data in the countries that we work on. We've looked at time series data of relative prices of fertilizer and maize to look at the value cost ratio and profitability of fertilizer use and expansion of fertilizer use in these countries. We looked at the production function and modeled through fixed effects models, correlated random effects, and also use instrumental variable approach in some of the countries. So I'll name 2 findings, David, because of our time constraint. One is on the yield responsiveness. As we would have expected, there's wide diversity and heterogeneity in the yield response estimates that we have estimated, wide diversity across countries and within countries. But in general, we can group the countries into 2 groups. One are those with low yield responsiveness and the ones with higher yield responsiveness. The first set of countries with low yield responsiveness, our yield estimates range from 4 to 7 kilograms of extra maize harvested for an additional extra 1 kilogram of nitrogen applied. And these countries cover Ethiopia, Nigeria, Malawi, and Tanzania. And the other country with higher yielding or higher response is Ghana and Uganda. So what do these figures mean? The low yield responsiveness countries, 4 to 7 kilogram. The high yield responsiveness countries, 15 to 20 kilogram of extra maize for additional 1 kilogram of nitrogen. What do these figures mean? So in those low yield responsiveness countries, for every average farmer, they could only get 4 to 7 kilogram of additional maize for extra additional application, 1 kilogram application of nitrogen. So if we compare it with relative prices or the value of the yield versus the cost of the fertilizer to apply, these are low. And these are unprofitable. And this provides, this incentive for the farmers to continue to expand their use of fertilizer. I'll mention, one more, finding, David, and this is our analysis on the fertilizer price, subsidy. And I have to name Malawi, wherein the price of fertilizer subsidy program has been the center stage of their agricultural policy. So our profitability analysis, confirms that indeed the subsidy has provided greater price incentive, greater price attractiveness, and increase, the use of fertilizer in the country, right? And, with evidence of modest, productivity and food security, impacts. However, our study have also highlighted that the 2023 subsidy rates of 80% subsidy rate in 2023 may have been excessive. And we collaborate with other studies that have recommended lowering the subsidy rate to 20 to 40%. But the most important implication for Malawi from our study is the need to address the low yield responsiveness of inorganic fertilizer. There's only much that the subsidy can do if you have low responsiveness and low productivity, right? So we emphasize looking seriously into rechanneling some or all of the subsidies, to greater research and extension, investments, so that we can identify optimal management practices to maximize yield response and overall productivity. Over.
Thank you very much. Now I want to pivot to Jaweriah, who takes us away from this set of countries in Africa where a lot of research is being done and a lot of really interesting evidence is up for discussion in this session, to Bangladesh. And Jaweriah, tell us a little bit about your analysis.
Thank you. Thank you, David. And good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about the paper, Input Subsidies, Fertilizer Intensity and Imbalances Amid Climate Change and Evidence from Bangladesh. So this is a study conducted in Bangladesh using 3 waves of a panel data in 2011, 12, then in 15, and then in 18, 19. And this paper investigates the impact of input subsidies on fertilizer use in Bangladesh, focusing on how these subsidies interact with climate shocks, specifically droughts, and their implication for balance of fertilizer application. This study was motivated by the critical role that fertilizers have forever played in Bangladesh's rice production, which is vital for food security, being the staple crop there, and the growing concerns about imbalanced fertilizer use, leading to soil degradation and environmental harm. The issue that we try to focus on and zero in on this paper and we aim to address is whether input subsidies exacerbate or mitigate fertilizer imbalances, especially what happens when these farming households are under climate stress and how these effects vary across farm types, seed varieties, seasons, and also soil types. Bifurcating the motivation for this study, we have 3 or 4 vital points. The first is that input subsidies are really very large across Bangladesh. In 2021 to 2022 fiscal year, they were approximately 39.20% of total agri-subsidies. It has been pointed out in some recent reports that Bangladesh is extremely vulnerable to climatic shocks. And a figure that kinds of highlight that is that the country witnessed 185 extreme weather events from the period 2000 to 2019. And this resulted in 3.72 billion in terms of economic losses. Fertilizer imbalance is something which has again been highlighted, and an example would be the IFPRI report by Ahmed et al., which came out right after the first wave of the Bangladesh Integrated Household Survey data, and it highlighted that across different kinds of fertilizers, there was a discernible mismatch among the actual and the recommended use. Urea was too high, while some other fertilizers such as muriate of potash and TSP were less than the recommended levels. Very briefly, there were some highlights from this study, and I'll keep the results very, very brief. So the first one was fertilizer use, the impact of subsidies on fertilizer use. And we found that in general, input subsidies do increase fertilizer application. But when we bifurcate across different fertilizer types, there is some variation. For example, in case of urea, DAP, and DAP and MOP, there is an increase. But for some other, the impact really isn't very significant. For example, in the case of TSP. Climate shocks also vary across different fertilizer types, but in general, we find that fertilizer use is attenuated when these farming households are faced with climate shocks such as droughts. Fertilizer imbalances presents rather a mixed picture. And we find in this study that subsidies in general widen the gap between recommended and actual usage, but there is variation because for some fertilizers, households may go over, but in some other cases, they might remain under the recommended fertilizer use. Heterogeneity results are a little bit interesting because we find that larger farms are the ones that seem to be benefiting from subsidies, probably attributable to better access to subsidies. And across seed varieties, hybrid seeds are the ones that show the highest level of impact. This is followed by high-yielding varieties and local varieties. Looking at variation across season, Boro season is the one that sees the largest impact, followed by Aman and Os. Across soil types, also there is variation where certain soil types are exhibiting a stronger relationship in response to subsidies in terms of fertilizer use. So I will stop there and hand it back to you, David. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jaweriah. This is, I think, a really interesting demonstration of, the convergence of findings from research across several countries facing very different problems, but at the same time dealing with very similar challenges and potential solutions. So Catherine has already hinted at a few of these issues, especially the policy dimensions of these issues that you've raised. And I want to pitch this back to all three of you, and I also want Pauline to join as our fourth. Given everything that we've just talked about, if you were transported to the office of a Minister of Agriculture or Environment or Finance in the countries you were just discussing, what advice would you give? Now, mind you, I was going to say if you were magically transported to these offices, but I should point out to you and to our audiences that all of us actually often have occasion to be in those ministers' offices, or more importantly, in the ministries themselves, working with policy advisors and analysts on these exact issues, on how to manage a fertilizer subsidy system, or how to improve extension on fertilizer recommendations, and so on and so forth. So it's hardly magical. This is part of many of our jobs. I know Catherine does it. Akuffo, I'm sure you have to do it at times. Jaweriah, you and your co-authors as well. So tell me, what advice would you give? This time, let's go back to Jaweriah. What advice would you give?
So there are, I believe, based on the results of this paper, there are three policy suggestions that seem to be prudent in the context of how subsidies are managed and disseminated, and how fertilizer use is shaping up in Bangladesh. The first is the role of extension services. So the extension services can be used to promote balanced fertilizer use, because one of the highlights of the result really is the fact that balanced fertilizer use is something which is not observed and is being exacerbated by the way the subsidies are currently disseminated, and climate resilient practices. So the results indicate that subsidies increase, for example, urea overuse, particularly during certain seasons, also in the presence of climate shocks. So there can be a scale up of training on drought resilient varieties. There can be a scale up of how to manage during certain seasons where these impacts are stronger. So that's the first that, The second is, how about integrating soil-specific and climate-smart agriculture guidelines in the way the subsidies are disseminated? So just to kind of bring out here the fact that in Bangladesh, there is a universal subsidy on fertilizer, but beyond that, input subsidies are afforded more recently through the Agriculture Input Subsidy Assistance Card Program. So how about bringing soil-specific or climate-smart guidelines into the way the agriculture input subsidies are disseminated? Our findings show that fertilizer use varies significantly by soil type. So subsidies, for example, increase urea use on sandy soils, but decrease it on clay soils. So how about integrating those kind of nuances in the way subsidies are disseminated? The third point is and this is really more difficult, but the results kind of indicate that over time, this might make sense, is to reform the universal subsidy policy to prioritize smallholder and vulnerable farmers. So currently, it seems that it's the larger farms that are benefiting from the dissemination of the subsidies, and they are the ones that have access to most of the subsidy cards. And these subsidy cards are primarily the way these households are accessing subsidies for inputs. So how about focusing more on smallholder and vulnerable farmers and shifting towards them, trying to mitigate the imbalance between fertilizer use and subsidies?
Very good, very good.
Yeah, that's the three.
Those are excellent recommendations, and they capture some of the nuance that we were talking about earlier. Akuffo, how about you? Just very quickly, 2 minutes. What would you recommend?
Thank you. Thank you. I'll keep it brief. So based on the results from our study, one of the things that I highlighted earlier was affordability appears to be the main constraint to fertilizer use, and of course sustaining adoption. So addressing this barrier is very important. Of course, we've been talking about the subsidy program in here. being the tool for such. So I will recommend, like the subsidy program, but of course being also paired with other complementary inputs, like irrigation, improved seeds, and then, of course, access to credits for farmers in these countries. The other policy recommendation that I will provide based on the results of this study is the fact that households at the lower end of the wealth distribution from our study are more likely to reduce or discontinue fertilizer use, right? So based in the midst of, like multiple crisis. So in response to that, I think, redirecting attention, of course, to other complementary practices like Jaweriah is talking about climate smart agriculture, focusing on that. And then also like climate legume intercropping, organic fertilizer, crop rotation, those practices are very important. When actually we ask the farmers the coping strategies, very few of these farmers actually mention these practices as, as mechanisms to cope with the high fertilizer prices. So probably, like promoting these practices are very important. The last thing that I will say is we found a large share of households also reporting that they technically don't need fertilizer, being the reason for not, applying, which makes us, believe that probably these farmers are yet to really grasp the benefits of inorganic fertilizer. So probably there is a need to actually improve extension services, like delivery to actually, promote this this fertilizer, inorganic fertilizer use among the farmers in the region. The other thing, of course, in the spirit of nudging farmers to use the inputs is probably leveraging farmer to farmer information sharing, like field demonstrations and start. If one farmer is using inorganic fertilizer, their farm is doing better than the other, then probably if I see that, then I'm more likely to actually want to try this input. So those will be the recommendations that I'll provide based on the results from our study.
Very good. Catherine, you've already talked about some of the policy recommendations you would give, say, the Ministry of Agriculture in Malawi. Maybe add one more to that, and then I want to go to Pauline, if I could.
Can I have three very quickly? One is to emphasize that we need to look at relative prices and not just, look at input prices and the skyrocketing, blaming the input, prices that are skyrocketing as the issue. Output prices are also going up. And this provides good opportunity for farmers, especially food, like producers. So a focus strategy could be to strengthen market access, market linkages, so that farmers can take advantage of these market opportunities and relatively favorable relative, prices. The second one is high transportation costs. It affects profitability, not just agriculture, but many other industries. The case, it's very relevant for all countries, but I'll name one example. In Uganda, high yield response, modest relative prices, modest profitability. Why is it that Uganda has the lowest fertilizer use globally? This is because of high transportation costs and unavailability of fertilizer for those who need them. Lastly, but maybe most importantly, again, I emphasize the need to address the low yield responsiveness and productivity overall. We might need more granular data, more detailed, spatial data beyond the regional and zonal breakdown that we have done in the paper, so that we can see which, areas have high yield responsiveness and where we can promote, input and fertilizer, so that we can also identify on-site specific, recommendations, so that we can balance yield and environmental externality related to overuse of fertilizer. Lastly, we have been saying a lot about these management practices that can increase yield response and also increase productivity. We have been mentioning organic fertilizer, mulching, improved varieties, name it, right? But why is it that we still have low adoption of this sustainable climate smart management practices? What's the issue? So I think we need to seriously look at the barriers of adoption, the supply and demand side, factors that affect this, adoption, and see what's really possible as optimal solutions within our specific context. I'll stop there, David. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. I couldn't agree with you more, all three of you. Now I want to turn to Pauline and ask her the same question. What would you give as policy advice? And we've talked a lot about fertilizer, inorganic fertilizer, Pauline, but you're the expert on this panel from sort of the soil science and agronomy perspective. So I'd very much like to get your ideas. And I'd like to see if they're a little bit different than what a group of economists might come up with. So, what kind of advice would you be giving on fertilizer use and soil health based on the evidence we put together in this special issue? Over to you. Pauline? All right, it looks like Pauline has gotten cut off. She was having some bandwidth issues earlier during our testing. So let me go straight into some questions that are coming up from our friends online. I see some potentially good ones here that I'll pitch to the first three members of the panel. So here's an interesting one. Do you think in the long run we have the capacity to switch to a completely nature-based, chemical-free agriculture, especially in the global south? And do you think envisioning something like this is even meaningful or evidence-based? I'd like at least one of you to address that concern. And then there's another question, a couple of questions here. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of fertilizer dose responses and quantities and things like that. But I want you to think a little bit about sort of the role of industry in all of this. As someone put it in the chat, do you believe that making friends and partnerships with countries that manufacture inorganic fertilizer or supply the raw materials could actually make fertilizer innovation or solutions become not just effective but also accessible to smallholder farmers? And then the third one is, how would you think about removing the tax on fertilizer imports to the extent that it exists in some countries versus subsidizing the distribution and use of fertilizer through voucher programs or any of the subsidy programs we are talking about here? Which one is the economic policy that you would prefer? And some of this might go back to, Economics 101, where we learn about, public spending, tariffs, and taxes. But I'd be interested in hearing your take. So that's three questions. Why don't each of you tackle one or two very quickly? And then Pauline, just chat to me in the chat box if you're available and able to come online. Akuffo, let's start with you.
So I think I will say basically for the first question on switching completely to nature-based fertilizer in the long run, I'll probably say no, in the sense that inorganic fertilizer and other organic fertilizers will serve as complements, no matter the stage that we get to. So I don't think that we'll completely switch to nature-based fertilizer. Probably like the agronomist might think differently, but I don't think we can go that route. And the issue of removing tax on fertilizer import versus subsidy, I mean, that is a pretty big debate, whether or not. But the question then will be if taxes are removed from imports, as to whether that will actually reflect in the prices that these farmers are going to face is another thing, right? So I will probably say that like the subsidy should be the way to go, because that actually will reflect what's like the price that the farmers are actually going to pay, because some of these the taxes may not actually be transferred directly to the farmers. So that is what I'll say in that regard.
Okay, great. And then, Catherine, back to you.
I agree with what has been said. I just have one to highlight, and it's the fact that in the, for example, African countries that we have studied and other countries that we focus on, there's also potential to develop the industries using natural ingredients, to develop the industry of fertilizer. For example, phosphate rocks are available in many of the countries that we work on. Looking at that locally produced fertilizer could also be an option to go for, in addition to importing fertilizer.
Excellent, excellent. And finally, Jaweriah.
Yeah, I agree with Catherine and Akuffo, but I would like to add a little bit on. I believe the question was that if you became friends with country that manufacture organic fertilizer. I think that was it. I hope I got the sense of the question. So I think in a country like Bangladesh, there are a few factors to consider. The first is awareness. Even if organic fertilizer was available, the first aspect to consider is, are these households aware of the difference between switching or the benefits of switching to organic fertilizer? The second consideration, I believe, would be accessibility. How accessible is this? How accessible it is to these households? And the third point would be, what would be the tangible benefits that they could receive from switching to organic fertilizer. So, and I believe that kind of helps to circle back to one of the recommendations of the study. What about thinking of spreading nuanced awareness of fertilizer use across these households? So yeah, that's a thought that I have in response to this question.
Excellent, excellent. Really good points, all three of you. So we're about out of time for this panel, and unfortunately, we've lost Pauline due to connectivity issues. I believe she was joining us today from Dar es Salaam. So apologies for that. I really wanted to have Pauline weigh in. Nonetheless, I think we've had some great input from our three authors here. We've raised a lot of issues here, and I won't even try to summarize them. But I would, highlight the point that there's a lot of cross-country heterogeneity in what we found in these studies. There are a lot of issues on subsidy and subsidy targeting. That's been a long issue an issue we've talked about for a long time, and I think the door is still open to figure out how to do that effectively, if at all. And obviously, we've talked a lot about affordability and access more generally, for fertilizers and remedies that go beyond inorganic fertilizers to building soil health and soil responsiveness to inorganic fertilizers. So I'm hoping that if nothing else, this encourages the audience to go and actually read the articles. I believe some, if not all of them, are open access in this issue. Sinafika, my good friend who wrote in one of the chats, was asking about control variables. In Catherine's article, you'll find them all described in her paper. And anybody else who has technical questions, please feel free to go to the articles. If you can't access them, reach out to the authors and we'll provide you with copies. I'm sure that's possible. And I look forward not only to engaging with everybody more on this topic, but to looking forward to more research, because we've asked a lot of questions, we've provided some answers, but the book is certainly not closed on this topic. So we hope that you'll join us in the future in conducting research and advocacy and messaging on these issues around fertilizer and soil health. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, David, and thanks to the speakers in the previous panel. Really nice overview of different findings across countries. So many thanks. We're now moving to a new panel, and I'm really delighted to have some external actors with us for non-research actors with us for this discussion. And we're going to focus in particular We know that the fertilizer sector is very prone to shocks for a number of reasons. So the key question for this panel now is how can we build resilience to future shocks in international and domestic fertilizer markets? And we're going to start off with Peter Odhiambo Owoko, who's the head of the Policy Coordination Directorate of Agricultural Policy Research and Regulations with the State Department for Crop Development and Agricultural Research in Kenya. Peter, given your focus on policy in your role, could you speak to the policy interventions that Kenya undertook during, in response to and as a follow-up to the dramatic supply shock that we experienced as a result of the beginning of the war in Ukraine, to build greater resilience to shocks, with a special focus on smallholder farmers? What worked and maybe what did not work so well? Over to you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to share our experience. This would be not on research anymore now, but we'll be talking about the practical experience on implementation of some of the policies towards addressing the challenge of access to fertilizer. Kenya's push for agricultural transformation has been driven by a series of declarations and initiatives at the continental level, focusing on increasing fertilizer use, improving soil health, and supporting smallholder farmers. One of such declarations includes the Maputo Declaration of 2003. So for about 2 decades now, we've been addressing the issue of access to fertilizer. And this Maputo Declaration emphasized on increased funding to agriculture so that more and more input could be accessed. One of the key inputs spoken to was fertilizer. In Abuja Declaration of 2006, this explicitly aimed at raising the fertilizer use from about 8 or so kilograms per hectare to about 50 kilograms by the year 2015. Good enough is that the country Kenya has managed to achieve that. Following to that was the Malabo Declaration of 2014, which reinforced these goals by promoting accessible, affordable, and sustainable fertilizer as part of the broader agricultural growth strategies. These were going hand in hand with other policy interventions, including the introduction of the Africa Fertilizer Financing Mechanism, which was under the event of the African Fertilizer and Soil Health Summit, which is targeting increasing access to fertilizer through funding so that fertilizer could easily be manufactured at the country levels to make sure that it is more affordable. However, the biggest challenge that a country like us faced, Kenya, is that the nitrogen-based fertilizer, which is the most important, cannot easily be manufactured. The only option we had was to manufacture from ammonium gas, and that became even more expensive, and therefore we just have to rely on import. We don't have good sources of other minerals, potassium, phosphorus, so we still have to import. We have never discovered any in our country at the moment. So for us to respond to these issues and to implement these policies, Kenya's initiated a number of projects and programs, and the first key program was the National Accelerated Agriculture Input Access Program, which was initiated in 2007. This was in response to the Abuja Declaration, and this is where farmers were assisted to access fertilizer and seeds so that they are able to plant, particularly for the staple food crop, corn or maize, if you would like to call it so. So in this year, farmers were given free vouchers, which they didn't need to contribute. Kenya's support program, further to this, there was a second approach to it, where now we intended to increase fertilizer subsidy through the National Fertilizer Subsidy Program in the year 2008. This was caused by the changes in prices of fertilizer. Now, the NAP, National Agriculture Accelerated Input, we expected farmers to raise their input. Once you use the input, you increase your production, sell part of the input, and buy fertilizer. But this was affected by the changes in global prices of fertilizer. They could not be able to do that. Supporting that was the Kenya Cereal Enhancement Program, Climate Resilient Agricultural Livelihoods, where use of e-voucher was also supported with climate resilient practices and linking farmers to market. So as I've said, there are three key situations which affected the interventions. One is the COVID-19, which have already been spoken to. which ran from the year 2020 to around 2023. That greatly affected the prices of fertilizer, the shortages in fossil reserves, and the geographical tensions around Russia. Ukraine also affected the fertilizer because we import all our fertilizer. But on top of that, there's also the severe droughts. We had 2 consecutive droughts in the year 2021, 2022. Though you are giving subsidy, but the production remains low because of dependent on rain-fed agriculture. 80% of our production is from rain-fed agriculture. We therefore conclude that for accelerated agricultural growth and transformation, there is need to have coherent and progressive policies, which must include aspects of marketing of the produce realized out of the subsidy program. Because if you don't do that, the farmers don't realize enough and they're not able to reinvest. And 2, we also observed that even if you give an e-voucher to the farmers, the number redeemed versus the number given out is so small because of lack of ability to purchase, even paying the subsidy a bit. So we think there's need also to have a credit support, subsidized credit to support the subsidy access. I wish to maybe leave it at that and wait for questions to extend the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you also for mentioning the African Fertilizer Soil Health Summit, which actually took place in Nairobi. And it was a terrific event. So now we're heading over to our next speaker, Latha Nagarajan, sorry, who serves as the Director for Sustainable Opportunities for Improving Livelihoods with Soils Consortium. She's with the International Fertilizer Development Center, IFDC. Latha, what role do markets play in enhancing resilience to fertilizer shocks? And how can existing bottlenecks be addressed? And then secondly, if you could also briefly speak about the role of fertilizer market information, how useful is that in terms of providing early warning about potential market disruptions? Over to you. Thanks, Latha.
Yeah. Thank you, Charlotte. As you rightly said, that markets can enhance fertilizer resilience through different mechanisms. One in terms of the price discovery or offering transparent pricing signals, and then offer supply diversification or different sources of diversification of the sources of supply, especially during the crisis or during the normal times also, to take care of the prices, and also offers as a risk management mechanism by offering different tools. As you know, that the different gaps or the bottlenecks offered through the markets generally range from lack of transparency in terms of the market information or regulations to the barrier, that is regulatory barriers or barriers exist in terms of the regulations and the implementation, or the financial constraints, especially faced by the smallholders in accessing the fertilizers or in the use of the fertilizers as such. As you know, that the crisis that happened since 1970s onwards, still the latest crisis through supply chain distractions due to COVID, and also due to the Ukraine-Russia war, have taught us several valuable lessons. One of the key things we learned again and again, resilience in markets exists, especially when you build stronger foundations through building local markets, which came out strongly in some of the studies put forward by IFPRI also, and also the structured value chains, better governance, and market transparency. So, but this requires a coordinated action or an approach. So in IFDC, we did develop certain comprehensive approach that combines not only the market information systems, but also with certain key market development strategies to offer sustainable solutions. It offers solutions not only during the normal times, but also during the crisis time. So one of the things that consistently we have been providing since 2009, immediately after the food crisis in 2008, is to offer the market information or the market intelligence. through our platform, web-based platform called africafertilizer.org. Africa Fertilizer offers market intelligence, and especially in the real-time market intelligence to the stakeholders in the fertilizer value chain and also other policymakers, and through different ways through its platform. And this real-time price monitoring also offers farmers, governments, and other policymakers to some immediate data to respond to the crisis and also distortions in the market in an effective manner. Especially during the crisis, the COVID crisis, or during the supply chain crisis, the fertilizer dashboards, which we launched, also served as early warning systems for supply disruptions. We can't provide all the shocks, but we can see them coming. So that's the purpose of these fertilizer dashboards or these platforms, to offer offer solutions in the real-time basis. Basically, for example, even in Burkina Faso, our tracking tools identified potential shortages way early. So the procurement by the government and the policymakers was very effective, and they could plan to prevent any national level shocks during the crisis time also. Again, this market information or the market intelligence also serve as to improve the technology-driven efficiency also. Some of this data truly transforms into outcomes. We can leverage the market data or the market intelligence which we receive through the platform to deliver site-specific fertilizer or soil fertility recommendations on time through sophisticated decision support tools. Because as you know, that information is power for smallholders especially, and information dissemination is also key in these aspects to even access better technologies in times of normal and also during the crisis time.
Fantastic. Thank you, Latha. I think we're going to have to wrap up here. Thank you so much. Really excellent remarks. Shami Zingori serves as the Director of Research and Development with the African Plant Nutrition Institute, APNI. And APNI supports effective and balanced plant nutrition in Africa to increase agricultural productivity and reduce the environmental footprint of fertilizers. So Shami, what are farmers to do in times like we've recently seen of decreased supply or prohibitive prices? What are some important plant nutrition practices that they need to be thinking about during times of crisis?
Yeah, thank you very much, Charlotte. The previous speakers have in a way provided insights relevant to this question, but I want to explore this further in the context of the 4R nutrient stewardship, which is at the center of our work at APNI. The 4Rs, which in simple terms represent right source, right rate, right time, and right place of nutrient application, are flexible and dynamic practices specifically designed to assist farmers in responding effectively to shocks within agricultural value chains, especially when it comes to challenges with fertilizer access and fertilizer prices. I just want to highlight 3 critical adaptations of 4Rs that help mitigate the impact of fertilizer crisis, especially at the farm investment decision level. First, given the shortages and the price hikes, as has been alluded to earlier, farmers normally reduce fertilizer applications. And under these situations, a tactical approach to nutrient applications that involves targeting nutrient inputs precisely to address immediate nutrient deficiencies and focusing on the most limiting nutrients rather than strategically building long-term soil nutrient stocks provides a cost-effective strategy that buffers the potential impact on productivity in the times of fertilizer limited supply. Second, there's also scope to prioritize local nutrient resources And this specifically includes organic resources and locally available nutrient solutions that can be used alongside mineral fertilizers to help farmers manage inputs effectively and affordably while reducing the dependence on the volatile global supply chain of mineral fertilizers. Thirdly, what we have actually seen as one effective strategy is actually a cropping system strategy, whereby farmers can shift the choice of crops towards crops that have lower nutrient demands. And this, for example, can include extending the area that is cultivated to grain legumes. And this not only reduces the need for nitrogen fertilizers, but also increases nitrogen supply through biological nitrogen fixation. And this shift enhances ecological resilience and overall cropping system productivity by the multiple benefits of more diverse cropping systems. Ultimately, strengthening farmer capacity in efficient and effective nutrient use and promoting the adoption of best agronomic practices is vital towards ensuring long-term agricultural resilience amid any future global disruptions. And this is very much at the center of the 10-year Africa Fertilizer and Soil Health Action Plan that was ratified by the African Union member states at the summit in 2024. And by building the capacity and creating an enabling policy and market environment, we can be better prepared for weathering any future crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shami. We're going to move from Africa now to South Asia. Avinash Kishore serves as Senior Research Fellow. He's based in our IFPRI office in Delhi. And Avinash, could you talk to us, could you provide some examples, let's say from Bangladesh, which we've already had Jaweriah speaking about earlier, India, Sri Lanka, and Nepal, about policy interventions undertaken in the name of building greater resilience to fertilizer price shocks. And again, which ones proved to be effective and which ones perhaps not so effective? Over to you.
Thanks. Thanks, Charlotte. So South Asia is interesting because these four countries that you mentioned, they took four different approaches. So Bangladesh, under pressure to save foreign exchange, in two sorts, first in April 2022, August 2022, and then in April 2023, led to a sharp increase in urea prices. Over the two rounds, the urea prices increased by about 70%. They also increased the price for phosphate and potash fertilizers, though by less amount because they were less subsidized. So Bangladesh allowed the prices to increase. It's very recent. We don't have more updated data on actual use of fertilizers, etc. But early evidence seems to suggest, Charlotte, that food production didn't go down. The rice production has continued to go up. And I think that's very important and a useful lesson. What we do not know, and we need to study carefully, is what happened to farmers' profits. Why? Because in this season, many countries, barring India, have tried taking away fertilizer subsidies or reducing or rationalizing them, but subsidies always come back. And I think that to understand why that happens, we need to understand how taking away of subsidy affects not just fertilizer use efficiency and overall food production, but farmers' profits, because that probably puts pressure on governments to bring them back. Moving to India, India has the opposite response. India, the taxpayers absorbed the whole shock. World prices skyrocketed. Urea prices haven't changed in India in 15 years, even in nominal terms. Actually, phosphate and potash prices, 15 years ago, India implemented a policy where they'll fix the subsidy amount and let the prices float with the world market. But they reversed that effectively. And as a result, India's fertilizer subsidy increased from around $11 billion to $30 billion, about 10%, 7-8% of ag GDP. It has come down a little bit, but India's fertilizer subsidy just increased. And as a result, India had just continuing supporting farmers, absorbing the shock fiscally, and it had put a lot of pressure. Nepal mooted the idea, the government mooted the idea of increasing urea prices by 80%, phosphate by about 30%, and potash by about 15-16%. But there was a strong opposition, and they dropped the idea. It doesn't mean that the farmers didn't face higher prices. A lot of Nepali farmers depend on informal imports from India of cheap subsidized fertilizers. So the prices farmers did absorb, but as a result, Nepal's fertilizer subsidy burden also increased. For Nepal, one has to keep in mind that they do not have, the government of Nepal doesn't have a lot of degrees of freedom in setting its fertilizer policies, or especially prices. Because if they let fertilizer prices go up, then the formal markets is crowded out by informal imports of highly subsidized fertilizers from. So in that sense, Nepal has limited degrees of freedom, and we should keep that in mind when advising government of Nepal what to do. Sri Lanka's case is well known. Sri Lanka took an extreme step in early April, where they declared this country 100% organic, also partly under forex pressure. That led to a disaster because there was a sharp decline in rice production, tea production. Tea earns them foreign exchange, so foreign exchange situation probably became worse. And even when they removed the ban on imports, the subsidies had gone away. Sri Lanka had even higher subsidies, and it led to massive increase, among other things, in headcount ratio, the poverty. And Sri Lanka is yet to recover from that sort. So 4 very different policies. As an economist, I think Bangladesh's policy is most interesting. And IFPRI and other institutions should study it closely, because it will give lessons for countries like India to say that, okay, you can let prices increase where they are very low without hurting food production, without hurting food self-sufficiency and other goals that governments care about. I'll stop here, Charlotte. Thank you.
Great. That's a really interesting contrast of these 4 countries' approaches. Let's turn now to some questions. Maybe just to, I could ask Latha maybe, or Shami, could you just give us an update briefly on the African Fertilizer Soil Health Summit? Are things moving? I mean, in a way, the declaration and the summit findings all say the right things, right? They all say the things that all of you have said throughout this whole seminar. How are we doing in terms of moving forward? Peter, maybe you could also come in on that question.
Thank you, Charlotte. Yes, of course. The post-summit, yes, the country-level plans are being prepared and also being ratified in consultation with the AU, and it's being discussed at a very high level, especially in terms of the soil health interventions, and also how best we can coordinate in 4 different aspects. That is, in terms of the technologies related to the soil health, and then data and market information with regard to fertilizers and soil health. For the first time, AU is also trying to include indicators that are related to the soil health, also in formulating indicators and also monitoring that. And then how best the private sector can also participate in this continent-wide initiative in promoting fertilizer and also the soil health action plan put forward in during the Nairobi Declaration. Thank you.
Yes, I think it's also important to note very briefly that there is also effort to work in regional hubs to coordinate sub-regional efforts, and so far a lot of progress has been made to establish the West Africa Hub, the East Africa Hub, and Southern Africa Hub, and also plans to work on the North Africa Hub. So this hub will form the regional coordination bodies that will support some of the country-level roadmap development. Thank you.
Excellent. Peter, did you want to come in briefly on that as well?
Yeah, just to add to what I've been saying, that the push by the African Soil Health Summit is really there, and at the country level, we are very keen on implementing the aspects of the summit. Particularly right now, we are saying at the policy level that all our soils have to be tested before you buy any fertilizer to add. And the essence of also supporting local manufacturing so that they can blend fertilizer specific to our soil needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I actually want to come back to that question of production. And I think Catherine Ragasa raised it earlier, that more domestic production is a way to build resilience. And maybe we can start with you, Avinash. Given the experience of India, which really does try to produce a majority of the urea that is being used in the country, has that proven to be a good strategy, considering that the price of feedstocks is higher, rather than perhaps relying a bit more on international markets, which of course can be volatile at times. What is your thinking there? And then maybe again coming back to you, Peter, how do you see that calculation, say, for Kenya? There is now, of course, urea production in Africa, in Nigeria, but unfortunately, a lot of that is actually exported off the continent. So maybe you could just speak a little bit to that as well. Let's start with you, Avinash.
So India now wants to become completely self-sufficient in urea production, and this is a part actually of a wider strategy to have like what's called Atmanirbhar Bharat, like self-dependent. So its import substitution is becoming more common than it was, say, 10 years ago. I don't think it's driven primarily by cost considerations, Charlotte. It's more about strategic considerations. India depends, among other things, a great deal on China for its urea imports. So my sense is cost calculus. I haven't looked at the details of how our domestic production of urea compares with if we imported it. We know that given India's subsidy policy, where producing units get subsidy on top of their cost of production, so it's not even incentivized. Many units produce at much higher cost than what the global efficient frontier is. I think this is not purely by economic consideration. There are other considerations weighing in on it. And I won't be surprised if our costs end up being higher, though we'll see exactly what they are. The goal was 2025. Now I'm hearing 2032. I need to check the numbers. But yes, this is by strategic considerations more than pure economic considerations and general tilt towards import substitution in the country.
Excellent. Peter, what is the thinking in Kenya about increasing domestic production?
Yeah, we think it is the way to go, but at Kenya level, our studies show that it may not be economical just to have a factory for producing fertilizer for Kenya alone. We need to have a regional approach so that you can address, say, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. At the moment, there have been efforts to import rock phosphate from Tanzania so that they can be processed into fertilizer, phosphatic fertilizer. Tanzania attempts to produce the same, but still it has not been very effective. Kenya does not have oil like Nigeria. That is why we don't have nitrogenous fertilizer. Nitrogenous fertilizer only comes from petroleum products. And the efforts to use the gas to convert it into ammonia is a little bit too expensive and not very economical. So it's a good idea, but then we need to consolidate our efforts as a region, because the economies of scale demand that you produce in mass for fertilizer for you to be economical.
Excellent. So I'm afraid we have to wrap up this panel. In just sort of my key takeaways here are, really important to have a continent-wide approach. So again, pointing to the Fertilizer Soil Health Summit and all of the activities coming out of that is I think a very important tool for building resilience in African markets. I really like Latha's point about information as power, and I think that applies in two ways. Market information is hugely important for building greater resilience, but also in terms of Shami's presentation, right? Information about how to use fertilizers, how to integrate organic fertilizers, how to think about cropping in legumes, etc. Also very important information extension that has to be provided. And then I think, I forget who it was, somebody said fertilizer subsidies always come back. And I think that's probably a true statement. So given that, I think really important area of research for all of us is to think about, okay, if fertilizer subsidies do always tend to come back, then what are the best practices? How can we make sure that the subsidies that may always come back are actually the most efficient and the most environmentally conducive? So I think those are my takeaways from this very interesting panel. And I now want to hand it back over to Ruth with apologies, because you only have a little bit of time here to wrap us up for today. And thanks so much. Over to you, Ruth.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. And actually, I think you did a great job wrapping us up, and you said many of the things that I wanted to say. So I will be very brief. I just want to say thank you, a big thank you to all the panelists for a really fascinating and rich discussion. I think that it really sort of underlined, the discussion we've had really underscores the contribution of this special issue. And so a big congratulations to everybody involved in this. So just a couple of remarks on the agenda ahead, very much in line with what Charlotte mentioned. We heard through the discussions today about the importance of a wide range of policy instruments to improve the productivity of soils. So specifically, market development, the importance of market reforms there, of transport investments. We heard about extension and information, and also research and development. And there's plenty of material in the special issue that underscores the importance of all of these. And we also heard that, yes, subsidies, they always come back, and we heard about the challenge of subsidies. But I think just in closing, it's useful to remember why subsidies are popular and why they come back, because that can help us think about the agenda forward. They're popular because they're immediate, unlike R&D. They're easy to implement. There's no extension service that needs to be trained, and they offer a private benefit to people, which makes them politically beneficial. So unlike things like market development, which benefit many. So as we think about how we improve and innovate on subsidies, I think it's important for us to remember these characteristics that they hold that make them politically popular. And think about how do we innovate in a way to bring soil-specific, climate-smart guidelines into the design, how we can use them to subsidize other inputs. We also need to think about how to innovate on other interventions that are more efficient, but that also have these characteristics, such as cheaper and simpler soil testing, low-cost strategies for providing information on climate-smart practices that improve soil health, payment for ecosystem services, or decoupled benefits to farmers. We're taking some of these things up in the innovative subsidies theme in the new CGIAR program on policy innovation. But I know that it will be the collective work of many of us on this call today to try and move the agenda forward in this direction. But again, a big thank you to everybody involved today, and to the special issue for really sort of setting us up well to continue on this journey. Many thanks.